Welcome and greetings, relatives. Thank you for making the time to join us here on Restoring Her Circle, Collective Responsibility and Healing Centered Justice for Girls. As we begin, I want to ask folks, if you can, take the next 1 or 2 minutes as we launch this poll question to gather information that's going to support us in having this dialogue. So I'm going to ask our technical support staff if they can launch that question. And as you're filling that out, I want to take this opportunity to also introduce myself. I am Osvaldo Ozzy Cruz, the Senior Manager of Education and Families Initiatives with the National Compadres Network, and I am your facilitator for today. And as soon as we get the responses from the poll questions, we will then move forward with introductions of your facilitators as well as the panelists. And so I appreciate everyone being here and dedicating time to this important topic on addressing what's necessary to support young women and girls. Again, if you're just joining us, I am Osvaldo Ozzy Cruz, the Senior Manager of Education and Families Initiatives with the National Compadres Network. I want to thank you for making time to be here with us as we address and have dialogue around restoring the circles that are necessary to support young women and girls. And so if you're joining us just now, we're asking you to respond to the poll questions. And as soon as we're done receiving those responses, we will move forward. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and all of you will receive a link to access the recording. I also will take the time to mention that if folks have comments and questions, that you please utilize that chat function to communicate with us. And so we have designated staff that will be monitoring that for us. Thank you very much. Okay, and if my support staff can let me know if we are ready to close the polls.
We are at about 77% of responses.
We'll give it about 1 more minute for folks who are just joining us to integrate themselves, and we're asking if you can, please, to respond to the poll question. We're also asking if you are viewing the chat function, if you can, to please introduce yourself, state your name, organization, and the location that you reside in or the location in which you carry out your work. Okay, I see people responding to that chat. We're going to give us 1 more minute. We're close to 80% of folks who have responded to the poll question. So again, if you're just joining us now, we're asking if you please look at your chat function, if you look at that poll question, and if you could please respond to that. And thank you, relatives, for all of those of you who are introducing yourselves on the chat. So as we will begin to close out that poll question, again, just want to reintroduce myself. I am Osvaldo Ozzy Cruz, the Senior Manager of Education and Families Initiatives with the National Compadres Network. And as we are asking you to also share your location, I am zooming in from Southern California here in the Los Angeles County area. And again, want to acknowledge all of you for your work and for dedicating time to being here with us. Thank you for your responses on the poll questions. As we begin, I do want to dedicate some time to acknowledge the Office of Youth and Community Restoration, OYCR, for sponsoring this webinar, for creating opportunities for us to be able to have these dialogues, and also acknowledge and recognize their commitment to restorative youth justice. We have seen a lot of investments that support trauma responsiveness that is really culturally informed. And so part of what we're doing here today is to learn about how do we support young women and girls. And so want to acknowledge the Office of Youth and Community Restoration, as well as the Brotherhood of Elders Network. That is an intergenerational network of men of African descent that are dedicating to creating supportive environments where Black males can thrive. Alongside and in partnership with the National Compadres Network, who our work is really to strengthen individuals, families, and communities by reclaiming and honoring our authentic cultural values as well as identities. And a part of that partnership between National Compadres Network and the Brotherhood of Elders work is what we call Healing Generations Institute. And part of that work of the Healing Generations Institute is really to create a Healing Generations framework that promotes familial community healing, addressing persistent community strife, the things, the challenges that impact our communities. And we do that in partnership. And so this webinar is being sponsored by OYCR and is brought to you on behalf of the Healing Generations Institute and team. And so I want to welcome everyone here. As we begin, and before I introduce our moderator and our panelists, just want to remind folks that all of you are on mute. I encourage you to engage with us, to ask questions, to comment, to affirm anything that you hear that you feel aligns with how we do this work. And so if you can, we encourage you to utilize that chat function. And in doing so, I would like to just read over the bios of our moderator and panelists so that you get a semblance, just a piece of who they are. And then we will have the opportunity to hear from them. And so our moderator for today is Maestra Deborah Camarillo. Maestra Deborah Camarillo is the daughter of Esteban Leos Camarillo and Anita Figueroa. She has worked in the field of substance abuse and transformational healing for over 30 years. Motivated by her personal experience of addiction and incarceration, she's a certified addictions treatment counselor and has an MA in theology with emphasis on Latino leadership. Maestra Camarillo continues to serve as the executive director of the Latino Commission in San Francisco, California. She has led and managed substance use disorder and dual diagnosis treatment facilities and has comprehensive knowledge and sensitivity to issues of diversity, traditions, and cultural norms of the Latino population. Maestra Deborah has extensive experience working with the criminal justice population and has devoted cultural programming based on what we call La Cultura Cura philosophy and methodology. She is the founder of the statewide Latino Conference, Strengthening the Roots, and trainer with the National Comadres Network, where she promotes transformational healing for young women, a coming of age programs that really focus on indigenous-based principles. She's humbled and grateful to the Creator and to those on whose shoulders she stands, her partners, her familia, and her dogs. And so I want to acknowledge Maestra Deborah Camarillo, who you see on screen, who will be our moderator for today. And in addition to that, I want to also acknowledge and thank our panelists. And so I will be sharing with you a little bit about Shani Shea and her bio. Shani Shea has earned her bachelor's degree in African American Studies and a minor in education in 2022, and her master's degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education in 2024. Shani is the director and founder of Incarceration to College and Pathways to College. She uses Black feminist pedagogies to increase the educational aspirations of in-custody and marginalized youth. In addition, Shani uses her program to provide UC Berkeley students with hands-on fieldwork experience. Shani served as the advocacy co-chair for the Berkeley Underground Scholars from 2019 to 2022 at UC Berkeley, and now serves on the board of the Underground Scholars Initiative. Shani forwards education access and systemic change by serving as the chair of the Alameda County Education Subcommittee. Shani is a 2021 Elder Freeman Policy Fellow. Her advocacy work at the state capitol has helped to pass bills such as AC A3, which pushes to amend the Constitution to stop indentured servitude. Shani also serves as the president of the Black Underground Scholars to recruit, retain, and advocate for Black previously incarcerated students in the UC system. Shani is a 2021 Fireball Scholar. Her research focuses on effective teaching methods for incarcerated and marginalized youth. Shani received the 2024 Intellectual Contribution Award from Harvard Graduate School of Education, the 2020 California Women in Leadership Award, the 2022 Mather Good Citizens Award, the 2024 Alameda County Probation Department Commitment to Excellence Award, the 2024 University of California Berkeley Excellence in Management Award, and several honors from the Office of Nancy Skinner. Shani hopes to create a space where educational practices meet the liberatory needs of society. A lot of accomplishments there, Shani Shea, a lot of great work that you've been recognized for. I want to acknowledge you for all that. And the people who see that work in you and that leadership. In addition to that, I also want to welcome and acknowledge and introduce to you Lindsay Rosenthal. Lindsay Rosenthal is the subject matter expert for ending girls' incarceration at California's Office of Youth and Community Restoration at OYCR. She is nationally recognized strategist, systems change leader, and technical assistance provider with more than 15 years of experience helping jurisdictions advance equitable, community-based approaches to youth justice with a particular focus on girls and gender-expansive youth. Lindsay founded the initiative to end girls' incarceration at the Vera Institute of Justice, where she partnered with youth, community-based organizations, advocates, researchers, and public systems leaders to transform policy, to shift narratives, and advance community-based alternatives to incarceration. She also served as the technical assistance provider through the U.S. Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention National Girls Initiative, supporting jurisdictions across the country in advancing gender-responsive reforms. Previously, Lindsay was awarded the MS Foundation for Women's Fellowship, during which she co-authored The Girl Story, The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, published by the Georgetown Law Center, and Poverty and Inequality. She holds a BA from Florida International University and a master's degree from the University of Chicago. And so I want to welcome you and acknowledge you for all of that work, Lindsay, that you have done and supported others across the country to end girls' incarceration. And so as you can see, relatives, we have a number of experts in the field who are willing and able and have accepted the invitation to share their knowledge and experience in hope and in light that there is something that you can take from this webinar that will be useful as you do your work in communities. And so with that, I will pass it over to Maestra Deborah Camarillo, who's going to lead us in this dialogue conversation.
Thank you, Ozzy. Appreciate that. And I just want to say again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Because we're so grateful that you have chosen to be part of this important conversation. Today's webinar will focus on the juvenile justice system, and with that particular attention to the experience of the gender expansive, the young women, the girls, their lives that are too often shaped by this system that was not designed with their healing, safety, or dignity, or for that fact that even their cultural identity at the center. So as we move through this discussion today, I just, again, want to invite you to listen with openness, with curiosity, and can reflect on how history and policy, lived experience, and community responsibility all intersect in the lives of the girls that are impacted by the system. We also encourage you again, as you have heard by Ozzy, that throughout the webinar, I know questions will come up. Please use the chat box, and we don't want to miss those questions. So please use that, because your voice is very important. And it's an important part of this learning space. Of course, our hope is that for us to imagine a more comprehensive, a more compassionate community and healing focused response for our gender expansive girls and young women. And this afternoon, I am truly honored to be in the presence of my fellow panelists with Shani and Lindsay. And before we begin, I want to bring this one thing. And I want to bring the aspect of the indigenous perspective, which is so important. When I say indigenous, I'm talking about all those communities around the world that were were seated here in this dimension, but they understood their position between the sky and the earth. And that is that they understood this, that we are the caretakers of the next generation. And that is through women that lives are brought forward and a new generation is birthed. We also understand that through women, through our DNA, both generational wounds and generational strength are passed on to the babies entering this world, besides the experiences we acquired throughout our lives. I share this because the girls impacted by the juvenile justice system are among those next generation keepers. Too often, this system has harmed, violated, and re-traumatized them rather than protecting and supporting them. And they take that forward. So I want us to remember that as we talk about this discussion. And as we begin, I want to read 3 poems. They're not very long, but they're from 3 young women that were incarcerated at the time. And the first one is entitled, Now That I'm a Felon. Now that I'm a felon, I never had a childhood. I call it 14 and grown. Family torn by the bottle, I am all alone. Breaking glass and screams in my peripheral vision. Dad breaks me like it's his mission. Mom doesn't care, she never listens. I'm stuck in this life, I'm imprisoned. I don't get to decide for my life now that I'm a felon. It's going to stick to me like an addiction, even though I'm trying to break through like ammunition. Truth is, the felon will always stay, but I gotta hope to see better days. And this author wanted to stay anonymous. This one is by Jordan. Tell them that I frown inside, but I refuse to drop my crown. Tell them I'm in pain, I'm hurt. I'm 6 feet buried in the dirt. Tell them that I'm me and always will be me. And that's Jordan. And lastly, just something. Coming in and out of here is just like a pattern. Probation is like chains pulling you back from things that are important. Judges making decisions on your life that you didn't ask for. Your parents telling your PO everything you did wrong. Coming in and out of here, it's just like a pattern. As we begin this conversation, I want us to think about, this criminal justice system for girls. And historically, like how did it happen? Well, there's some things that we do know. And we do know that historically, the laws and the policies has traditionally been designated with boys in mind and men in mind, leading to gender bias on how girls are treated. They look at victim or criminalization without considering the underlying issues of victimization and the family trauma and the societal trauma. Of course, the lack of gender-specific programs, we know that. Overlooking trauma and mental health, which is really crazy because the system is implicit in re-victimizing and traumatizing or continuing that to happen in the lives of our young girls. And we could continue to talk about that because there's many more things, the lack of support, the difficulties of reunification. And we're going to talk about an educational perspective that Shani will share a little bit more in this, a little bit more in a little while in this webinar. But one thing we do know is that it's rooted in a patriarchal framework. And that isn't new for us as community of colors. We understand that, and we've always been implicated by that. The also one thing to consider is that when we look at the historical part about it, is that this is the foundation. It's a foundation that was not built for women nor for girls. And so with that being said, I want to now pass it on to Lindsay and ask, can you share some of that historical context that you have learned along your path? Thank you.
Sure. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here. Looking at who's on here, I'm so humbled because I've learned so much from many of you over time and look forward to this being a discussion. And thank you for sharing those poems. I think I just wanted to start out by sharing some research that I did on the early delinquency system because I think it really shapes where we are today. Because as we've already talked about, these systems were kind of founded on patriarchy and racism, and has been a feature since the beginning of juvenile courts and prisons. And so there's a book called Reform and Resistance: Gender Delinquency in America's First Juvenile Court. And it's a historical study of gender in the first juvenile court in Chicago in 1899. And it found that the courts created a category of delinquency offenses known as immorality offenses that included incorrigibility that were at the time used almost exclusively for girls. They accounted for 80% of girls' cases in Chicago and only 2% of boys. The immorality offenses in the early systems included associations with vicious or immoral persons, vagrancy, attendance at saloon and pool halls, the use of indecent language, nonviolent altercations with parents, sexual behavior, and even changes in girls' appearances that indicated the possibility of sexual intercourse within the past few days. These offenses were used to criminalize girls for their disobedience and resistance to strict gender norms that existed at the time. And when they were used to criminalize boys, it was usually for being gay. And at the heart of this treatment of girls in the early court was a paternalistic view that girls who departed from feminine norms or moral standards needed the court's protection and intervention to prepare them to become moral women, mothers, and wives. So, and that continued this sort of bias in the laws of the early juvenile courts for a long time. So even as recently as 1970, New York State's status offense law still applied to girls until their 18th birthday, but only to boys only until their 16th birthday. So that kind of codified gender disparity and how the laws apply, it doesn't exist in the same ways anymore. But we do still see, legacy of that in the notion of boys will be boys and girls being held to a different behavioral standard when they violate conventional expectations of compliant feminine behavior, like breaking rules or skipping school, violating curfew. And those behaviors can be viewed as more rebellious or problematic because it's a girl that's doing it. And that also applies for, we see LGBT GNC youth disproportionately in the system because also they're not, conforming to gender norms in those ways. And of course, all of this is layered on top of, a system that was also founded in racism. There's all kinds of research today about, adultification bias and Black girls being viewed as more adult than their white peers from as young as 5 years old, meaning that they're perceived as in need of less protection or nurturing, that they're seen as more independent and knowing more about adult topics, which can contribute to disparate arrest and involvement in the juvenile justice system, as well as, school push out. I think even, what we call today as a sexual abuse to prison pipeline, in the early courts, girls who were victims of sexual abuse were viewed as immoral and blamed for enticing men to rape them. And they were sent away to juvenile justice facilities in order to address that behavior, while the people who harmed them did not have accountability. And I think we still see that today, in the criminalization of girls who are victims of sexual abuse or commercial sexual exploitation, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about later. So even though these are, very old systems that were founded, centuries ago based on these norms, it's still applying. And one thing that I just want to share, and you all can look into this more on your own time, but there's a project called the Incorrigibles Project, which did archival research on some of the first facilities that were used to incarcerate girls. And this artist was just going through old archival records and looking at, photos and files of girls who were incarcerated in the early courts, in the early training schools in New York, and found Ella Fitzgerald's photo in there because she was a foster youth. She had, run away from foster homes and ended up in the training school incarcerated. And the words that were used to describe her, ungovernable, incorrigible, are still applied to Black girls in the foster care system today in New York City. And I think the talent that she had and how she changed culture, right, is the potential that so many of the young people who are inside today have. And so I'm always reminded of her story and the greatness that can happen when young people can, rise out of this. So I wanted to share that hopeful piece. But, even here in California, we know that some of the first people incarcerated were girls on the missions who were incarcerated for the same reasons I've already talked about, like enforcing morality, keeping them, from sexual behavior or rape, enticing men to rape them, that same framing that I used earlier about the New York facilities. So, this is a huge question. We could talk about the history of these systems for a really long time, but I think the gender piece of it often doesn't get spoken. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that because I know that those of you who are working with girls today are still seeing some of the same language and some of the same, disparity in treatment applied to girls. That although a lot has changed, very little has changed in some ways in terms of the circumstances that bring young people in.
Thank you, Lindsay. I know that's, I'm glad you shared about Ella Fitzgerald. And we could go on, right? Because there's so many other women that have been impacted in that way. But we don't hear the success of the stories, right? We just hear sometimes a lot of that negativity. But I wanted to come back to what you said about the LGBT community, because I think that's such a big disparity as well that I think often gets overlooked. And that is that, when we look at lesbian, gay, bisexual, so there's probably a representation of 5 to 7% within our youth in the US. When we look within the incarceration, the juvenile justice system, that then shoots up to like about 40%. And why that's so important, because again, if we're basing it on a morality system, and if we're basing it on a patriarchal system, then how are their needs being met, right? Especially when we talk about that gender expansion. And so looking at that, our needs not being met, and a system that is designed for boys which have different needs than young women and girls and our gender expansive youth. What is it like, to be in that system? What is that system like experiencing it on a day-to-day basis? What does that feel like? And I want to go now to Shani to share some of that, really experiencing that system. Let's give a good vision of what that is like. Thank you, Shani.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm grateful to be in this space. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Lindsay, for what you shared, just given the historical context. Thank you, Sister Deborah, just for, leading this work, prepping us for it. I think, when we think about what it's like to be incarcerated as a woman, I would say from my own personal lived experience that it was a direct contradiction of everything it meant to be a woman, and not just in what we see like in movies about what femininity is and about what softness is, but just who we are and the way that we behave in the world, and what our contribution has been as women is completely stripped from us, right? So you're thinking about women who are having children in custody and don't even have access to their children. You're thinking about women who have come in as mothers and then don't have access, right? And so how that also feeds into the system. But specifically for young women, I think the most important thing is that we know just off the top that 60 to 70% of the youth who are incarcerated have disabilities. We also know that over 70% have IEPs. We also know that the same number goes almost up to about 80% in some counties of youth that have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And we know that all incarcerated adults, 100%, are more than likely to have experienced two adverse childhood experiences. Why is this important? Because when we look at young girls, we're looking oftentimes at the criminalization of young women for protecting themselves against the very violent acts that have been happening to them, that have put them in positions that, to be really honest, are very often not fair. And then once young women are incarcerated, what it looks like is what it looks like 100% is that you have young women who are in the system, don't have access to the programming and educational support that they actually need. You have young women who are having to compete against males who are obviously targeted for many different reasons for programming services, for the right to have access to to even go outside on the yard, because the idea, and I'll say this honestly from being incarcerated, is that when women are incarcerated, it is something wrong with who we are. And therefore, we actually don't deserve the very things that any woman on the outside would. And then to even make that even deeper, to consider that incarceration, the financial part, right? The actual emotional part, that burden we know falls on women, right? So what you have is a system that time and time again says either it's the woman's fault that her child is now in the carceral system, or it's the woman's fault that they've experienced the harm that they're having to protect themselves against. And so I guess I'll just leave it there in terms of what it's actually like to be an incarcerated female. But for our young incarcerated females, and I guess I'm going to go further. Sorry about that. When I think about secure track LRPs, most of the counties that we serve, and I have had the, opportunity to experience at least 5 different juvenile halls post the DJJ shutdown, is that many of the women don't even get access to what secure track youth get, right? So you have young girls who are there for years on end and don't even get access to programming, don't have separated units, because the idea is that there's not enough women to serve. It never looks at what are the actual needs. So if we're actually to look at our young women that are incarcerated, the highest level is there. Over 50% are young women who have experienced child sex trafficking. I want you to really understand what that means. And they're being criminalized because there's older adults, men and women, who are taking advantage of them sexually. And then they're being put in a position and being told, oh, you know what? The crime is just not that serious enough. No, it's not, because they've been being sex trafficked, right? However, we're still going to hold you in a space where you're vulnerable, and we're not going to give you access to the programming that you're needed. And I know some of you may be like, she's lying. There's no way. I will tell you factually across the board, young women and adult women, always receive less programming and less services, not based on our need, not based on the actual need that we would be looking at if we were looking at any assessment. It's based upon the amount of us. So then the question then becomes, is it that there needs to be more women incarcerated for us to get the resources and the services that we need? I would just say that's obviously problematic. But that's the experience. The experience of being an incarcerated woman or youth is that you've been traumatized, you've been victimized, you have been made to exist in spaces where you have to protect yourself. And then once you protect yourself, you are then further criminalized, right, for protecting yourself, and then not given the actual support needed to treat the root of the trauma. And I have to apologize. I'm obviously on Zoom, so my kids are running back and forth. So I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, and I think that that's one of the basic elements when we're talking about girls, right? And our gender expansion. You know, it reminds me of about the pleasure to work with girls and women for a great part of my career. And I remember one day as I was setting the circle up, you know, the young girls program. We're setting up the circle, and I was just getting the altar ready. And you know, this young girl came in, and she was there. She was kind of a little offish. The other girls came in, and she was a beautiful young woman. We started our circle. She didn't have much to say. You know, then the next week came, and I said, "How are you doing?" And she goes, the question was something to the effect of, "How do you feel?" And the young woman said, "You know what? I just feel like dirty trash." And I remember hearing that, and my heart just broke, you know, because we're talking in the program, trying to share about the value that our young people carry. And this young person, her mother was a quadriplegic, so she was raised with her father that had a drug problem. He was in and out of prison, so she got bounced around the family. Then she went into the foster care system, and then went from foster care home to foster care home. And her curse was she was beautiful. And because of her beauty, it just brought so much abuse to and taking advantage in her life. And she would say that. She goes, I wish I was so ugly so that nobody would look at me because of the pain she had endured. So we were coming to the end of the program, and we started our circle. And that day, as we came together, it was her turn to speak in the circle. And she goes, you know what? I'm happy to report that today I feel like trash, but I don't feel like dirty trash. And I've shared that story, and I know sometimes people get appalled, like, how is that good to just feel like trash? Let me tell you, when young people and young women are traumatized to feel so disgusted to be themselves, to feel dirty for just being who they are because of their experiences, because the system doesn't reflect the beauty of who they are. That was tremendous growth for her to go from dirty trash to just being trash. And so I bring that story so that we can, again, consciously look at this system. This is a system that is predicated on patriarchy. Patriarchy in itself brings in racism. It brings in, and it doesn't honor anything other than the patriarchy itself. And so thinking about that, I want to go back and going, so if we have a system that is predicated, how do we miss the needs that young girls need? Because often victimization is criminalization when it comes to our young girls. And so I'm going to invite Lindsay to share a little bit about that. So what comes to your mind, Lindsay? We're thinking about that, that kind of predicament that our young people have to face, our young girls.
I'm feeling heavy, honestly, from the story that you just shared. I think I'm gonna kind of back into answering that question, right? Because I think fundamentally, as Shawnee shared, so many of the young people, we can talk all day long about there are of course disparities in services available across units for men and boys, and then the girls units, all kinds of ways in which um, incarceration is not designed or built for anybody really, but it's not designed for girls and gender expansive youth, certainly. Um, but I think when I think about ending girls' incarceration, the reason, I've focused on that is because I think incarceration is this default response to what young women are experiencing in their lives, especially girls of color, Black, Latina, and Indigenous young people. And what I found is if you can bring those experiences alive, allow young people to share their stories, show the data for what is really happening, that this is a sexual abuse to prison pipeline, that judges openly say that they are incarcerating a young person because they believe she is safer in juvenile hall than she is in her community. That is a profound thing to say, that we think a young person is safer in a jail cell than she is in her own community. And that we as a community do not have a way to keep a young girl of color from being raped, abused, otherwise exploited in her own community, other than to jail her. If you just step back and think about that, it's a profound failure. And I don't think there's anybody involved in the equation, whether it's probation or the judge or the young people or their families or their community, who thinks that's the way it should be. So what I try to focus on in the Ending Girls Incarceration work is, can we agree that that is what's happening, first of all? Can we acknowledge that? And can we create a moment where we will say no more? We're not going to use our jail cells. We are going to let our girls have a childhood. We're going to find ways to make them safe, and we're going to figure out with them what safety even means, right? Because unfortunately, for a lot of our young people, if you really listen to them when they're being exploited, yes, that is a terrible experience, but that doesn't even rank in their top 10 things about what's not safe about their lives, right? So it's very important that we need to listen to them to figure out what are the solutions that they need to feel safe first, and then hopefully to help create a path to where they feel valued and free and the opposite of trash that's disregarded. But I can certainly understand how in a society that purports to be about safety and public safety, if you're a girl who is being profoundly abused and the way that you're being kept safe is to be locked up, why you would feel like you are garbage, right? Like that is what we are saying in our actions, even if that's not the intention. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I was just very moved by the young person who you described, and so I wanted to share that.
I'll take you to Shawnee.
Yeah, I was just gonna say if I could offer something. So I literally just took a note when you said this young woman that's, the idea was like, oh, to put you in a cell was to keep you safe. And I would just say for education, like something that I would never forget the first time a young person came home. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna interview them. I'm just gonna do like a pseudo, just talking to them. And I remember them saying, yeah, well, I never would have. I said, how did, incarceration impact your education? And they said, I never would have graduated if it wasn't for incarceration. And I was like, gosh, I didn't want to write it down. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was like, gosh, is this like a, and then I continued to do the work. And I heard time and time again that actually a lot of our young people would not have been able to safely do a lot of things go to school, interact with their peers, right? Participate in other ways had it not been for incarceration. And this is not a plug for incarceration, right? This is not to say that, yes, we should incarcerate our young people so that they can finally have safety. Once again, it really speaks to where are the resources. If we are able to see very clearly that our young women are not protected in the community, and I love research and I love data and I love statistics, right? But here's the other part. When your feet are on the ground and you're doing the work, it's no amount of data that needs to prove to me that this young woman has been sex trafficked since she's 9 years old. This young woman has been in an abusive household that's unsafe. This young woman has existed in a society that has taught her that sexualization is her only opportunity to make it out of some of the conditions that she lives. I don't need research for that. So I just am really moved because for me, it's problematic that we're in 2026 and we are in one of the wealthiest, most developed nations in the entire world, albeit perspective based. But the reality is that we do have a lot of resources here and we still, right, cannot figure out how to protect our young girls. And I would be honest and say that it's not because there are not places that haven't figured it out. It's because we continue to tell young women that it is your responsibility to protect yourself from violent behaviors in a society that does not love and support you. And to get into some of the statistics and the methods, right? There's adultification. As a Black woman, I can tell you that we know through adultification that young Black women, young Black and brown women, and let's just also note this, the highest increasing population of incarceration right now is young Black women, right? So I also want to state that, but we know through adultification that our young Black and brown non-conforming women are seen as older. So you have a little young Black 12-year-old girl who is seen somehow as an adult woman, right? Through the eyes of teachers, through the eyes of resource navigators, through the eyes of social services agencies. And so that also is another part of the layer, is that our young people are simply not seen as children. So what we're doing is we're saying, oh, when you make that same mistake, when your prefrontal cortex still isn't developed and you still went through trauma, we're not only going to incarcerate you, but we're going to incarcerate you and transfer you or treat you as an adult because we're not recognizing that you are still a young person. And this goes even further back, right? We talk about the historical context. The historical context is that when slaves were brought, and captured slave people were brought to this country, and even when they were still in their own homelands, the purpose was so that they could recreate other slaves. So a young Black woman's body was only as valuable as the reproduction. We see this in patriarchy already, that women's value is directly correlated to their ability to reproduce. Women go through our own issues around how that makes us feel, let alone, right, what it does for young people. But I really want to state that in our records, and you can look into the slave mart, that as soon as a woman could no longer reproduce, her value went from about 70,000 US dollars to about 8,000 to 6,000 US dollars because they no longer could recreate for the system of capitalism. And today, when we look at what happens to our Black and brown women, very oftentimes their value is directly related to their ability to recreate another body that can be incarcerated today, right? So you look at what happens in social services and CPS, right? You look at what happens in the carceral system, and what you realize is that what we have done is created a system that continuously traumatizes women, that says that they are not safe in their communities, and makes them, I would really say, put in a space where it can be very hard to survive, and very hard to exist. And then also say to this woman, we're also going to put you in a space where we want you to recreate other human beings. And then they are in that same position. And I really want to say this, and this is not a deficit mentality. I say this as someone who really honors and knows that I should not have made it. That there are so many women who I sat in jail cells with, who I serve today, who I constantly surround myself with, who will never have the opportunity to sit on a panel like this, let alone just feel safe and secure. I just want to say, just to feel safe. If you want to know a takeaway from me, young women feeling safe is the catalyst to their growth. We cannot grow, we cannot think, we cannot do anything if we are not in safe spaces. So Lindsay, when you said the problem is that we have not even figured out how to make our community safe for young women, that's what we really need to take advantage of. And then for those people that are on the side of probation and the carceral state, and I'm not knocking anybody, what I encourage you to do is take all of those resources and make sure that young women are safe, not only when they are incarcerated, but that when they re-enter society.
Thank you. Thank you. And that goes back to my opening point. When something that is so sacred, which is giving life, gets turned around and commodified, the impact of that for our communities is devastating because we know at the center is the woman. And so coming back to that, I was just reminding my own upbringing. And I was a victim as well of sexual abuse, like so many overrepresented in the system. And I remember, because I didn't have words to explain what had happened, and there was this rage and violence in me. The harm just made it. There was just so much rage inside. So of course I was like in fights. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell my parents. I couldn't. And so what that looks like, the magic words of incorrigible, right? Defiant, all these kind of things. And so instead of having support or someone being able to look and go, okay, what's going on with this child? They look at, okay, how do we contain? What do we do? Things like that. So with that being said, because we know who's represented in our system, what are those services that need to be there for our young people? And I love it. I'm going to go back to you, Shani, because I love just even the word underground scholars, because we are so smart. People locked up are so smart. They just haven't had the opportunities because of systems and life and poverty, and I could go on and on. But the intellect is there. And so I want to go back to Shani about some of that educational stuff and meeting some of those needs. What are those?
Thank you for that question. You know, I'm going to think about what I've heard directly from young women, and veer away from what I think. As an adult, I think it's easy to assume that I know everything. What I've heard from young women, doing the work is that what's needed is safety, right? Like just the ability to be safe. What's also needed is an opportunity for them to like learn skills that they feel are equitable to their male counterparts, right? So not being put into a box is something that comes up a lot. They need specialized support though as well. So time and time again, young women are saying that I actually read this in a survey. The programming that we're receiving is simply male programming modified for young women. We see that all the time. Why? Because the male population is the biggest population. So when people are building out their programs, right, they're thinking, oh, we're building for males, and then women are an afterthought. So young women need to be a first thought, right? They need to be, oh, this is directly developed for them. So specifically incarcerated young women need programming that is specialized for them, that is not a modified version of male programming. And then I'll reiterate the safety part. And then they need the opportunity, like I said, to build skills, if that's through education, if that is through learning how to facilitate, how to public speak, how to tell their story, and then real holistic and culturally relevant mental health services. So mental health services from women who have experienced what they have experienced. Mental health services from non-binary women. That's a big one too. If you are in the juvenile space, you're going to see that if a young woman or a young non-binary person, they're going to be put in male or female. They're not going to really have the opportunity to even coexist with individuals who have the same identities as them, but even further, be able to say that, hey, this is not where I belong, right? Like I would like to be in a different unit or somewhere else. So that's another thing. Like, yeah, there's male and there's female, but there's also non-binary LGBTQ plus youth who actually need dedicated programming, who need housing spaces that are safe for them, who need opportunities to learn and navigate what the world is really going to be like as they go on about their lives. I think those are the things for me when I think of like, what do young women really need? And then I'm always big on just resources, like so many people, young women included, but just so many people are just struggling with day to day. right? So whatever we can do for young people so that they can feed themselves, get to where they need to go, have their basic needs met. I think about Frederick Douglass. He said, you can't reach for the stars if you're reaching for a loaf of bread. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Young women need their basic needs met so that they can begin to focus on other things. When we know what we know about trauma and we know how it impacts the brain, is that when you're in your fight or flight, there is no, oh, I'm thinking about the next thing. Fight or flight means that you're living in a constant state of hypervigilance. That is what our young women are experiencing. And then the other side, and this one, please don't take this the wrong way. Young women need protection from the very institutions that serve them often. I will say that I have spent a lot of time in juvenile halls, and I hate to say it, for young women, I've seen a few very traumatizing incidences of actual staff members and institutional members being the people that are violating them and preying on them while in custody and outside in the community. I say that as an outside provider because what I find is there's often a higher level of scrutiny on outside providers than there is on the actual institution itself. And the institutional actors know that, right? And so what happens is that you create this culture of we're going to essentially brush what we've done under the rug and focus on outward. And so what I'm saying is that you need young women who know clearly that they are safe in the institution that they are in, because once again, so many young women who we support are criminalized for protecting themselves. So the behaviors that we see on the unit, right, in the halls are very often just a behavior that has been learned and conditioned so that the young people can survive. So safety, opportunity to build skills that are equitable for males, right? There shouldn't only be MC3 for men. Right? There shouldn't only be union trades for men. There shouldn't only be a program that gives credentials for men. That should exist for women. They need their own housing units as well. I'm reiterating that. I'm actually yet to see. I will just be honest, an all-female housing unit for secure track youth, for secure track female youth. For males, I see it all the time. And then, as stated before, dedicated programming both for non-binary and for those who identify as young women, gender affirmed youth. So those are the things I think that are real. And for me, I like to, I want to be mindful of, like, there's people on here that actually have the power to make these changes. So those are the big ones I would make.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. I remember doing time. It's an all women's institution. And it'll be like, well, so how did somebody get pregnant? Hmm. And so, but coming back, it reminds me of a case, and I shared it on our prep call that happened in Santa Clara. And it was a young woman that, was out one night with her boyfriend, and she was out, and there was two couples in the car, and as they went, her boyfriend and the friend that they were in the car with had an altercation. They see somebody on the street, they got out, and because she was in the car with these two boys, they ended up, there was a shooting, and so she ended up getting picked up as accessory to murder, and she didn't have anything to do with it. And the fact was that she was in the car because she didn't want to go home because it was unsafe to go home. So I want to, and then what happened from there was the big thing about, should we try her as an adult? And she fought that, didn't win, but all because she did not have a safe place to go. So coming back to this, we know, and I agree with Shani in the part, I got a lot of education doing time. It's just not the best place to get your education, right? We could have better places, and if people had the opportunity, and how do we make those things happen? And so if the institution isn't the best way, Lindsay, you've been involved in trying to put a closure to this institutional system that really doesn't serve young women and gender expansive youth. And so can you share a little bit about that? And, what does that look like? And what's our hope in that way?
Sure. So at OICR, there's a commitment to expanding ending girls' incarceration work statewide, and currently We're working in partnership with 4 counties. The effort is to replicate work that's happened in other places in New York City, Hawaii, Maine, and in Santa Clara, where there's still challenges to address, but where they did also maintain an ADP of an average daily population of 0 or 1 girl for over, I think, 5 years while we were working there. And the way that they accomplished that is that, there was the Juvenile Justice Gender Responsive Task Force where we had, judges, probation at the highest levels of leadership, and leaders like the Young Men's Freedom Center, programs that reflect the ethos that Shani is talking about having, programs that are purpose-built for girls of color, programs that provide real economic support to help young people get to a place of feeling safe and supported so that they can move forward. And, looking at what the practices were in Santa Clara County and seeing that there was a category of overrides to detention where low and medium risk youth were being overridden for this other category. And we looked at the data and it was exclusively being used for girls of color. And when we got underneath it and looked at the case files, it was a lot of young people who aren't safe, young people who were unhoused. And collectively, with both the community partners and the system partners, there was an acknowledgement that that's not why we want to be using juvenile hall. Director Lucero, who was then presiding judge, famously said one day in court, like, juvenile hall is not a hotel. We're not going to keep young people here because they have no place else to go. And so they started working on how they could use other community resources, partner with young people. Over time, young people became leaders in co-chairing and designing some of the solutions and programs that the county ultimately invested in. And I mention that just because I think there needs to be that kind of sustained collaboration to continuously not only just close the doors of the juvenile hall to young people when we're really concerned about their safety and the services they need, but to collaborate with the community partners to build up those resources. And that can be very hard. And, it's difficult conversations often. It takes a long time. But when counties commit to it, Imperial County has no committed girls, has maintained, a very low average daily population, has many days where their juvenile hall is empty as part of the Ending Girls Incarceration Action Network. And we're hoping to see the other counties, continue through that same process and get to those outcomes, because I think we can build up the community supports. And certainly right now is a very hard climate for CBOs. Funding is drying up for investing in youth-centered organizations that do this work for young people in the community. So that in and of itself is its own problem. But I think what needs to happen is you have to simultaneously have those investments in the community resources and have the commitment at the policy level across the court, across probation, across child welfare, that we are aligned to not using our juvenile hall in this way and instead collaborating on these community resources that will actually produce safety. And it's that collaboration and that focus, including young people and community voices, to really say what is needed. Everything that Shani said is all very well supported by evidence, though I hear you, Shani, we don't need the data because young people have been saying what they need for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years. But, there's very little research actually that has been done to create the evidence base that these programs work specifically for girls. But one of the ones that has been done was actually a randomized controlled trial, like highest level of evidence. It was done by Dr. Shabnam Javdani at NYU. And what she found is that if you create a program, one-to-one advocacy, where young people define what they need and you work with them to accomplish what they need to address what they see as their root causes, that the impact on young people's well-being and mental health and long-term outcomes, including delinquency, are stronger than what we put forward as some of the evidence-based programs out there. And to me, it's just the essence of gender responsive programming from what I've learned from all the organizations I've worked with is that really relational approach of having someone who you can relate to, who sees you and understands you and comes from your community and can deeply listen to what it is that you're saying that you need and can help you advocate for yourself to get that and build those skills and unlock those resources. So I completely agree, Shani, that that's the evidence base is there for everything that you said in terms of like what we really need to do for programming. And I think what OICR wants to see is for systems to commit to that partnership if it is the fact that their systems, their juvenile justice systems are currently incarcerating girls not for a concern of public safety, but for a concern for their own safety, especially to build alternative approaches that can divert young people entirely and can have alternatives.
Thank you, Lindsay. And let me be clear, this was before Judge Lucero's time. The judge, she's been amazing. She took the court to the people in the community. And we need more judges actually like her that can think forward and really meet the needs of our community. Yeah, I'm very grateful for her work. I know her and very appreciative of what she brings forward. And I know she would love to see this end for sure. With that being said, I hate this because our time goes so quick. It's been a pleasure to be here with Lindsay and Shani, but I'm gonna turn it back over because we wanted to make sure to get questions and any comments from the judge, not the judge, from her too, if she's here, maybe from the audience. So I'm not sure, I believe it's Noemi that will take questions from our audience and give opportunity for everybody if you have anything, and then I'll offer it back to the panel for last remarks. And so can I turn it over to you, Noemi, I believe, for
Yes,
questions in the chat box?
yes, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for the conversation. And we have two questions. The first question, it is, how can we ensure every girl has access to mental health care, education, and a safe place to turn?
So who wants to take it?
I mean, yeah, what always comes up for me is Renner's ecological model, right? So basically you can look it up online and there's this model where Renner talks about the micro and macro systems, right? So when we ask, what can we do to ensure that each young person comes home to a safe environment where they have resources? The first thing is the young person is who we're talking about. But in Renner's ecological model, there's these layers, right? There's the micro, which is the community, right? Then outside of the community, there's the police, there's the schools, there's an institution. Then outside of that, there's a larger government institutions. And outside of that, there's the belief systems. And then outside of that, there's things that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands, right? And so the reason I bring that up is because what we can do is very often what we do in our daily practice and in our own institutional or organizational practices, right? I don't know that it is possible that any one of us overnight or even a period of 100 years will change the entire system as it behaves. But what we can do is, number one, listen to what young people say and actually provide them that. The biggest thing I hear from young people is, you guys ask me 1,000 times, what do I need? And then you do something different, right? So we will go to young people and say, where do you want to go live? Well, I really want to go live with my grandma. That's the person who supports me. Sometimes I don't get along with her, but that's the best person. For whatever reason, we decide grandma's not the right person and we send them to a group home. And then the young person runs from the group home, right? And then we do this time. We do it. I'm talking about, factually, we do this time and time again with the same young person asking to go, for the same thing. We actually never give them that. And then we wonder at the end, right, of our experience, well, why is it that the young person never, got on track or did what we asked them to do? We never did what they asked us to do. So I would say, really, as best as we can, actually giving to young people what it is that they are asking for. And then what I feel is, well, the easiest answer is that we know where people are healthy. We know what healthy communities look like. Replicate that in communities that are under-resourced in Target. It's not hard to figure out why Piedmont exists in the way that it exists, and there's all different types of cities around it in the county of Alameda that don't exist in that way. Under-resourced, over-policed, not enough places for young people to hang out, not enough places for people to earn a living wage. People are having to commute 2.5 hours just to make a wage that maybe makes sense. Gas prices too high in California, everything too high for parents to even spend time with their young people, not enough summer programming. So I always like to say that it's not rocket science, right? Like it really isn't. We know what healthy communities look like. We know that across the board. There's all different types of, chat Googles that we could figure it out. So doing that, but also listening to young people, listening to what they need. And then lastly, understanding that it is one of the most unhuman things to do to leave our communities and to leave where we are culturally comfortable. I think that's a really hard part too. Most of us still want to have a relationship with the people who we were raised around, still have some of our values tied up, right? And that identity that we lived in or that we have been raised in. And so not coming from a deficit mentality, right? Not trying to really letting go of the respectability politics. I can say for myself, for me, that really, I mean, even today, I'm not gonna lie. There's sometimes that I'm like, gosh, I can tell these people are looking down on me. I can tell. I can tell by how you're treating me. It's because of my tattoos. Before they know, I went to Harvard and all of that, but I shouldn't have to do that. I should be treated as a human being long before that. And so also checking ourselves, right? So really checking yourself, and that can be done through, going to get a training for your organization, right? On how to be relevant, but also how to be humane. And I know it's like why people should be humane, but it is what it is, right? We've all been socialized the same way. It's okay to do to get some outside support so that you're not causing more harm when you're interacting with young people. So I'll leave that there, and hopefully it was clear.
Thank you. With that in mind, we have a question, also comment. As a former incarcerated girl, I know what it feels like to go through a system that doesn't always listen. How are you making sure girls with lived experience have a voice in the changes you're making?
Want to take that, Lindsay?
Sure.
Sure.
OICR has the youth advisory board, and so I can't fully represent that, but in terms of informing all of OICR's work, they are just an amazing group of young people, and there's a lot of girls and gender expansive youth represented in that work, and they are involved in all sorts of OICR projects informing the direction of the state overall. Within the EGI work, and I won't say that it works perfectly all the time. It takes time to build collaborations that actually fully are built around centered youth leadership. And I think different communities are in different places in terms of their ability to hold that support within systems change processes and government tables, which is where I spend most of my time. I think the Santa Clara approach was one of the best that I've seen, where in the gender responsive task force, the board actually funded young people to be the advisors to that process and to develop program priorities that could be considered by the whole task force and eventually to hold chair positions with decision-making authority on that gender responsive task force. We also partner closely with CBOs who every day is about building the leadership of young people, right? Supporting them through their healing journey and then building pathways to their own leadership because we know how powerful that is. So those organizations it's really important to support them, to provide holistic support to youth leaders to be able to come and participate in systems change processes in a way that is safe for them, is centered around them. And so I think that's also a really important strategy for the work. And then, I think really like in every project, there's a different approach, right? Like if you're doing research, participatory action research is a really good way to make sure that young people are centered in that practice. So I think depending on the project, there are different ways, but I would say there's always a way. And it's always the most important thing to listen and make sure that the solutions that we have are focused on what young people are saying they need and what their experiences have been. Because if we're not designing for that, then we're missing the mark.
Thank you, Lindsay. And to that, I want to ask you, somebody's asking if you could share again with us the name of the book you mentioned in the beginning about the juvenile justice history.
Sure. There's so many really good books. I don't want to say this is the only one. I will pull up the title for you in just a second. But that one just has so much really valuable information about the earliest juvenile courts and some of the policies. But we should go on to another question, and I'll get that, and Normie, maybe you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, and can I just share this as well? Because the poems that I read come from the title of the publication is "I Am the Voice: Girls' Reflections from Inside the Justice System," and it's put on from the Center of Poverty and Equality, Gender Justice and Opportunity. So Rights for Girls. So there's a bunch of poems there, really powerful poems. So I just wanted to offer that as well.
Noemi, I don't think I can chat everyone, but I just put the book into you on a direct message so you can share it out with the group. But it's Reform and Resistance, Gender Delinquency in America's First Juvenile Court.
Okay, thank you. I'll share that. There was another two questions by Rudy. I'm interested in finding a library of resources on evidence-based programming for incarcerated youth. Does one exist that any of you two know?
There is the evidence-based clearinghouse and I forget what it's called, but OJJD, the DOJ has like a compendium of evidence-based programs, but I think the last time we looked at it, there was only one that they included that was gender responsive, which reflects what I was talking about earlier, that often the research hasn't been invested into support gender responsive programming, also other culturally responsive programming models in a way that allows them to meet the criteria for being considered evidence-based. So I think it's really important to look at community-informed evidence-based practices and other resources beyond just evidence-based practices in these clearinghouses. And so I can pull up a couple of links.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that too, because I think we need to challenge the system again with their evidence-based practices, because most of the time it isn't our own people that are doing that work of the evidence-based process. And it's a system I think that is not reflective of a lot of our traditions. And so I know that there's a programming that has happened, but it's really community-based and community practices that sometimes don't meet the evidence-based practice system of Western thought. So I just want to put that out. So really, I think connect with the people that are doing the work and see what they're using is a big one as well. I don't know, Shani, if you want to have offer any there.
Well, yes, thank you for that. I was just got so because okay, so one, like, I've had the blessing of seeing a lot of evidence-based programming. I did my whole honors thesis aligned with, you know what I'm saying, like evidence-based programming and practices. And I think evidence-based programming is great. I think using research, right, to refine methods, to understand what works as we are developing programs is the best idea. But I also will say this, is that you can research till you're blue in the face. If somebody don't have their basic needs met, that's evidence, right? Like, so are we trying to put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound when we say evidence-based program? I've actually been trained in several, had the opportunity to work with males and females, and I'll be honest, our young people, there's not something wrong with them. They don't need some sort of, it's not like, oh, I'm going to teach this person how to think differently. What's happening is that young women specifically are being sex trafficked, abused, and violated from a very young age. And there is resources that are needed, but in terms of evidence-based programming, the evidence is that if you sex traffic someone, violate them, and traumatize them from a young age, they are going to have a hard time being successful. And I am very sad to say there's not a whole lot of programming that is going to completely diminish or eradicate what the negative outcome or impact would be. I'm not against evidence-based, right? But I am just saying that like it gets to a point. Actually, most young people will tell you they've been surveyed over and over and over again. They've been looked at, watched at, right? The evidence base is a model that makes money. I swear, I hope I don't get blackballed, right? But it's just the truth, right? I can say it as a program provider. I've been through academies to teach me how to teach other people how to make their program evidence-based. That's about, can I go somewhere and say I have an evidence-based program, so then and therefore you should pay me more money. Very rarely, we don't even know. Here's the truth. The Youth Law Center tells us we don't even know, for 60% of the youth that are being incarcerated, we don't even know what their outcome is. People are not even following incarcerated youth long enough to know, is the evidence-based programming working? Does it work when you do the survey at the end of 6 months? Sure. Does it work 6 years later, though, when Lil Sis is in the community? That's a different question. And I don't mean to push nobody, but I do just want to really be mindful that I believe that, yeah, you can probably get the outcome that you want if you ask the right questions, right? In the right amount of time, in the right container. But are we seeing the results in our community that we want to see? That to me, that's evidence. And that's what I would look at. And that's why I say it is really important to kind of understand what each individual youth needs.
Yeah. And to that point that you made, Shani, about sort of basic needs being a huge part of what actually is needed and not clinically trying to like alter the way girls think, is in that study I mentioned with that randomized controlled trial, which you need to have to get the evidence-based, I said that if you listen to girls and you identify what the needs are and then you support them in getting those needs met, then that's what's effective. The top needs that girls have are safety. That's the number one that comes through in their results. Material needs, that so that they can go to school, and like other basic support needs. So that is just, another reason why I think it's important to make sure that girls have access to mental health when that's something that they want, and to help them find practitioners that can serve them, but not to assume that's what's wrong, is that they need therapy when a lot of the behavior that is coming because needs aren't met, right? And that is hard to kind of fit into a just one program model. But I can share some of the research that I'm referencing later, Noemi, if you want to share it out afterwards.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. Because of time, there was a few questions that were left unanswered, but hopefully I can communicate if and when I do have those answers for you. But I'm going to send it back to Ozzy to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Noemi. And just want, for those of you that are listening, that we will do our due diligence to ensure that resources that were mentioned, titles of books that were mentioned, that we compile that information and share that out, as well as the link to the recording. I do want to ask folks, if you can, please, to ensure that you give us some feedback. We're going to launch a few poll questions, for which we're asking that before you log off, which shouldn't take you no more than 5 minutes, is to give us some feedback. And as we're doing that, I also want to acknowledge and thank Noemi Gomez and Michelle Gonzalez, who are on the back end supporting the work, and whose emails you might have received through our communications. And I would just want to acknowledge our panelists, as well as Maestra Deborah. I'm walking away profoundly touched, not just by the stories, but by the work that needs to take place in order to serve the needs of our community, specific to young girls and young women. Because all of us are connected to young women and girls, and for those of us that are parents, this message and where we have failed young women and girls as a father, really is concerning. And so, just again, want to thank you for all of your work, for agreeing to be a part of this panel, for sharing your experience, expertise, your teachings, your knowledge, and deep gratitude to all of you. And so, if anyone here, Maestra Deborah, Lindsay, and Roshani, want to offer some closing reflections, one, last comment that you want to share with folks, that, before folks log off, you're more than welcome to. Just not all at once.
Yeah. No, I just want to, thank the audience for listening. This is such an important message. And again, coming back to this, these are the keepers of the next generation. And I don't mean that in a way of just having babies. I mean that cultural knowledge, that coming together community. It is that, and traditionally we call that's the feminine medicine. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and especially it has been so great to be with Lindsay and Shani. It's great, and bendiciones to the rest of the audience.
I want to second what was said. I like very grateful for everyone just being here, listening, and even being interested. I know that what me and Lindsay and Deborah talked about can feel heavy, but I want to remind everyone that you have a lot of power in how you are and how you show up in every day. And for those of us that have the pleasure of interacting with young women, systems impacted and formerly incarcerated, something I always try to remind myself is that we are needed. They do love us. They do appreciate us. Although the work can be daunting and hard, please keep at it. And I look forward to continuing to share space with you all and continue to work together. Thank you.
I second everything that's been said, but I also want to thank National Compadres Network for putting this together and hosting it. I'm so grateful to see the space being created for these conversations to center girls and gender expansive youth, because it doesn't happen as much as it should. So thank you for the leadership to make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you all. So again, if I can just remind us, if you can offer some feedback, the poll questions are live. And again, we will be sharing the recording as well as gathering resources. And remind you that this is a webinar of a third webinar, a 4-part series webinar. And so please be on the lookout for our upcoming webinars. Follow us. We'll drop in links to our resources, to many of the resources that were shared. But again, we'll do our due diligence to ensure that you receive the link to the recording. And then continue to engage with you to see how we can be a better service to our communities. So thank you all.